There are actually several layers to this. After James Cook's expedition completed his observations on the transit of Mercury at Mercury Bay in November 1769, he passed the Mercury Islands as he left Mercury Bay to travel north. And he was unable to land there and thereby missed a whole range of really interesting and unique species. The arrival of people from Europe and from Polynesia was accompanied by the loss of many of our largest invertebrates, mostly birds. And some of these least modified islands, such as the ones in the Mercuries, are the last examples that we have of what these early systems look like. Since then, the islands have demonstrated how the invasive species have had widespread effects on ecosystems, and being amongst the first places that rats and rabbits have been removed from, they've also given us all kinds of information about the responses that have been possible after these pests have been removed. And finally, they have enabled us to demonstrate the potential for restoring species back into their previous range after the invasive species have been taken off. Here I can really only talk about the experiences with the Department of Conservation. There was very early recognition within the department that these sorts of relationships were really partnerships. So they had to work in a framework of respect, of recognition of each other's needs, and also reciprocity. Specifically for the Ngāti Hei, some of the smaller and most pristine islands in the Mercury group had been gifted by them as reserves. And so they needed to be involved in how we were to manage the islands in the future. The reciprocity part of it really came from DOC helping Ngāti Hei to remove rats and rabbits from Aotearoa Island, which islands in their ownership, and enabling species to be restored back to those particular islands as well. And finally, with Ahuahu, it's rather different because it's privately owned. And the island is particularly special to Ngāti Hei, who are regarded as a Hawaii or ancestral place for their iwi. And to their credit, the owners of Ahuahu have also involved Ngāti Hei in their latest conservation initiatives on the island. I want to talk about pride as it's in relation to what happens in the book, because that involves an affinity with the natural world and a sense of identity about a particular place. There are strong social effects of understanding the natural world, and people such as the supporters of Tiritiri Mātangi know that full well. Each time they visit the island, it's a little bit different, and usually in a positive way. They have this satisfaction of knowing where their part was in getting to that point. And Sir Michael Fay mentions that revelation of responding to bird calls and how the bird life burgeoned after the feral cats and rats were removed from Ahuahu. Now, this might be a rather Eurocentric view. Maori have a sense of place embedded in their whakapapa. So for many Maori, caring for the natural world is very little different just from looking after a relative. And it's something that I think is becoming more convergent with non-Maori's perceptions of things relating to the land and the landscape. The role of community involvement in conserving our ecosystems is something that probably is a question that should be turned around and asked in a different context. And maybe we should say, well, can we actually conserve our ecosystems without community involvement? And the answer is probably not. And as I point out in the book, the reason we have conservation issues is because of people and their effects on the environment. And so people have to be involved in resolving those issues. And what people can become more sort of aware of about conservation work is that it's not thankless. With the right conservation and changes to people's surroundings, the experiences can be quite profound. People such as those on Ahuahu have seen that. Many of those involved with island conservation projects such as Project Island Song, supporters of Tiritiri Mātangi, or on the mainland around Fence sanctuaries. All of them have had the pleasure of experiencing the results of their pioneering efforts. And interestingly enough, those places can have an influence beyond their own boundaries. And we show in the book that conservation on one island may have effects on another. And similarly, we know that in Wellington, that the success of Zealandia had implications for the wider Wellington region. Yeah, the inspiration for me to come into conservation biology or environmental work really didn't begin when I was very young, because that was a term that really wasn't in use. Perhaps my affinity for the natural world really came from my formative years when I was living in an isolated part of Aotearoa, or Great Barrier Island. But it really came when I attended university in the late 60s and 70s, when there was considerable publicity about the conflict between large multinationals in the New Zealand environment. So we were at a sort of an environmental crossroads at that particular point. Were we going to protect the environment, or were we going to exploit it? Alongside this, while I was at university, I spent a lot of time with the Auckland University Field Club visiting islands, and my first visits to the Mercury Islands were with them. And these visits really were the ones that gave me the first revelations about the effects of rats on island ecosystems. The drive behind writing the book like this was really based on my notes and papers that I collected when I was responsible for teaching at AUT. As the book developed, though, I really did become conscious of the need to pitch this to a wider audience, particularly those wonderful people who were involved with volunteering their time for conservation projects. It was a great educational experience for me to actually write the book, and I found most of the chapters fun to write. So I hope the book's just a platform. Perhaps other educational experiences can ride on the back of this one. Much of this work wouldn't have been possible without a large team in support, and I'd have to say that particularly with lizard conservation and island restoration, this is not the sort of thing that a single individual can really hope to be responsible for. And in fact, as I sort of understood more about the ways of going about those two topics, the more my papers that I published scientifically tended to become multi-authored, as so many more people had to be involved in that process. So in essence, I was just in the right place at the right time. And I think everybody involved in those teams deserves an award. Predator-free is a relatively recent addition to the sort of the conservation landscape. It's very timely and gave me an opportunity to sort of give people an idea of how we could even get to that particular mindset. So I wanted to provide an illustration in the book of the pathways we could follow to get to that point, and how it might be a viable option, and how we've already achieved that sort of situation in a number of places, perhaps, fair enough, at relatively small scales. There are reasons for hope, and great steps have already been taken. So what we're proposing in terms of things like Predator-Free New Zealand or large-scale conservation projects like those that are now coming under its umbrella, so there's nothing new. It's just simply a matter of scaling things up. So in effect, where we are now is building on something that's been done from quite small beginnings. We hear a lot about how biodiversity is being battered, but the book gives examples of how some forms of destruction can be reversed, how people can contribute, and how it could enrich our lives. And because of our history because of our cultural links. We may be better placed than almost anyone else to show how, as a country, we can work together to improve our environment and how this could have profound effects on our well-being.